Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. I pray that you're all doing well, especially on this cold day. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala make us warm and have good company, inshallah. So, alhamdulillah, subhanahu wa ta'ala has brought us to Surah Al-An'am, and as Shaykh Abdul Rafi and others have mentioned, this is a Meccan surah. So this is a surah that was revealed in the Meccan era. So this is interesting because, as we know, this part of the Quran is primarily from the Medinan period. So if you look at the previous verses, you see in surahs, this is Surah Al-Baqarah, for instance, then you have Surah Al-Ma'idah, you have all these beautiful surahs that are coming from the Medinan era. So we have this really powerful surah coming from the Meccan era, and as we know, the Meccan era, there are certain themes that are emphasized. That emphasizes the theme of the universe, the creation, emphasizes the idea of Tawheed. This is a time where the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, he was preaching the message of Islam, and people were mocking him, calling him a sahir, that you're a sorcerer, you're majnoon, you don't have the correct intellect, you're crazy. And in these verses, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gives this beautiful progression. So the surah begins and says, Alhamdulillah, alladhi khalaqa samawati wal ard. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala begins by praising. And this is the first time in the Quran after Surah Fatiha. So after Surah Fatiha, walhamdulillahi rabbil alameen. Praise be to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, who is the creator of all the worlds. And here Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says something similar. Alhamdulillah, khalaqa samawati wal ard. And He brought the nur, the light. The universe was dark, as we know. But then there was an explosion, and then light came, subhanAllah. So part of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, one of His names is an-nur, that He is the source of light. Allahu nur as-samawati wal ard. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the source of light. So if we're looking for light in our darkness, then we go to an-nur, the one who possesses the light. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala begins the surah talking about the heavens, talking about the earth, talking about praising Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, that nothing is like Him. Then we see the progression that says, هُوَ الَّذِي خَلَقَكُم مِّن طِينٍ ثُمَّ قَضَى أَجَلًا. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala then, after talking about the creations of the heavens and earth, talks about the creation of humanity. That all of us were created, and we were created from clay. We were created from something that was simple, that wasn't extraordinary, but something that was humble. And then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala then transitions to talking about that He knows what's inside our hearts. And He knows what we disclose to other people. He knows these things, and He can then, on Yawm al-Qiyamah, disclose this to everyone. And then we reach the verses of today, of 4 and 5, which speak about the Quran. So you see the beautiful progression, that first talking about the creation of the heavens and the earth, then talking about the creation of humanity, what's inside us and what's outside us, and then speaking about the ayah, the special sign of the Quran. That the Quran now is another sign of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Just like the sign of the heavens and the earth, just like the signs of humanity, the Quran is also a sign, but it's a sign that we do not, many in humanity, reject. That Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, everyone in the earth, they recognize the stars, they recognize the moon, the sun, but they don't necessarily do tafakkur. They don't connect us back to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So for the verses of today, after A'udhu billahi min shaitanir rajim, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, وَمَا تَأْتِيهِمْ مِنْ آيَةٍ مِنْ آيَاتِ رَبِّهِمْ إِلَّا كَانُوا عَنْهَا مُعْرِضِينَ. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says here that the people of Mecca at the time, that every time revelation comes to them from their Lord, they turn their backs on it, subhanAllah. فَقَدْ كَذَّبُوا بِالْحَقِّ لَمَّا جَاءَهُمْ فَسَوْفَ يَأْتِيهِمْ أَنْبَاءُ مَا كَانُوا بِهِ يَسْتَهْزِئُونَ. So they deny the truth when it came to them, but the very thing they laughed at will be brought back to them, subhanAllah. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala begins here by calling the Quran an ayah. So we know that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, in this general sense, an ayah means a sign. It could be something in the heavens, it could be something in the earth. But this is an ayah. Min ayat. So we just spoke about the ayat of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So this is one sign of the many signs. So just as someone would affirm the heavens, someone would affirm the sun, the moon, the stars, the light, the darkness, in the same way we affirm the Quran. مِنْ رَبِّهِمْ إِلَّا كَانُوا عَنْهَا مُعْرِضِينَ. So, of course, this is a sign of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. At the same time, people, they turn their backs on it. They reject it. And here, Fakhruddin Razi in his Tafseer, he mentions that this is the progressions of disbelief. This is the ghafla. Someone's being heedless. So when someone rejects the truth or they don't necessarily pay attention, they're in a state of ghafla. Someone may see the stars, the sun. As we exit Fajr today, we'll see the light. SubhanAllah. One of the beautiful things about Fajr is that you come in the darkness and then you exit and you can start seeing the light. SubhanAllah. You come, you drive, you walk, you see the stars, the moon. But then as you leave, those things disappear. So someone may see all these things, but then they may not pay attention or not reflect and connect it to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Then it says, فَقَدْ كَذَّبُوا بِالْحَقِّ لَمَّا جَاءَهُمْ. SubhanAllah. Then this is the second level, Fakhruddin Razi says. So someone is in a state of ghafla, they do not pay attention, they do not do tafakkur, connected with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. But the second level is to do kadhab, takdeeb, that they will reject it. They'll say, someone will tell you the truth, and then someone else will lie. And in this surah, when we read later on, we'll see that they say, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, they know this Qur'an كَمَا يَعْرِفُونَ أَبْنَاءَهُم. Just like they know their children. They know their names, they know their habits, they know what they like to eat, what they don't like to eat. They know this Qur'an, the Meccans, they knew it was revelation. But فَكَذَّبُوا, they rejected, they lied. They didn't do tasdeeq, they didn't do affirming of the Qur'an. And then we reach to the highest level, فَسَوْفَ يَأْتِيهِمْ أَنْبَاءُ مَا كَانُوا بِهِ يَسْتَهْزِئُونَ. SubhanAllah. But eventually, and they say this is for sofa, this means the future. But what is this sofa? Some scholars say this is Yawm al-Qiyamah, that on the Day of Judgment, everything that they used to mock, they will see it, and they will know the truth. Others say, for the Meccans, it was Yawm al-Badr. Yawm al-Badr, they came, a huge group of 1,000 kuffar, and they said, we're going to wipe out Muhammad sallallahu alayhi wa sallam. We're going to destroy Islam forever. But subhanAllah, those 300 people were strong and resolute, and then the Muslims won and were victorious. And then on Fath Mecca, that on Mecca, they said, this Islam thing, we'll wipe it out, but eventually they came and they took over the area, the conquest of Mecca, the opening of Mecca, and then the Islam became dominant in the Arabian Peninsula. So Fakhruddin Razi says this istihza is the highest level of disbelief. So someone may see something that's true and they may be heedless. The second level is that they lie, they reject it, they do kufr. I'm not going to accept that. The third level is that you mock the person who's telling the truth. SubhanAllah. That you feel the sense of arrogance and hubris, then now you start speaking out against the Messenger, sallallahu alayhi wa sallam. And here, later on, you will see in the Surah Al-An'am, the idea of them calling the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alayhi wa sallam a sahir, that he was a sorcerer, a magician. So this wasn't from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, but he was just making this up through using magic. Others, we'll see in the Meccan surahs, they say majnoon, that he didn't have an intellect, that he wasn't rational, that he wasn't put together. But Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala here says, on behalf of Muhammad sallallahu alayhi wa sallam, he says, يَسْتَهْزِئُونَ, these people, they reject, they mock you, but I'm here to defend you. Sallallahu alayhi wa sallam. And this is part of the Quranic revelation, that it's affirming the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alayhi wa sallam, affirming his humanity and affirming his message. So we also see the last point that was mentioned here in the Mufassirin and the Tafseer, is they say that this verses makes the point that in Aqidah, in theology, التقليد باطل والتأمل في دلائل واجب. So if someone comes and says, I'm going to pray like my father or my mother prayed, then that's, in Islam, generally that's acceptable. You can pray and follow a madhab or Imam Hanifa or Imam Shafi and so forth. But if someone comes and says, I'm Muslim because my parents were Muslim, that's unacceptable. That someone has to actually do ta'ammun, tafakkur. They have to contemplate, they have to reflect, and they have to make the aqidah, the theology of Islam, their own. that they have to consciously be Muslim, that they can't just be following aba'ahum, that their fathers used to say this, because that is similar to the mushrikeen. The mushrikeen, they asked them, why are you worshiping these idols? And they said, we were worshiping these idols because our fathers used to do so. But as Muslims, this is not acceptable. That as Muslims, we have to genuinely believe in the creed of Tawheed and the Risalah, the message of Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and we have to teach that to our children and our grandchildren to the point that they believe themselves. Because if they don't believe generally in their heart, once we pass away and we are gone, then they may eventually go astray. So part of the Islamic theology is for us to teach the religion in a way that people themselves take ownership of them and they buy into the religion, and that they're not forced to pray or fast or give zakah, but it's something that's genuine, that's intrinsic, that they want to do for the sake of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So brothers and sisters in Islam, to conclude, we see that these verses, they talk about the importance of reflection, ta'ammul, tafakkur, that this is part of our deen. يَتَفَكَّرُونَ فِي خَلْقِ السَّمَاوَاتِ وَالْأَرْضِ. That the idea of fakkur is not simply of thinking, but of reflection, of connecting to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And we also see the idea of humility, that the kuffar of the Quraysh, they didn't just reject the message, but they began to mock Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. This shows the height of arrogance. That you could say simply, I'm not interested or I don't want to learn, but then to go after and to criticize, this is a higher degree. That many of the kuffar, they will become Muslim, but many of them will see the reality of Islam in Badr and the Fath Mecca. And lastly, we see the importance of our aqidah, our theology. That our theology isn't based on taqleed, of following the people before us, but it's a conscious decision. That when someone does Islam, they are conscious in their surrender. That when Ibrahim alayhi salam, when he went to his son Ismail, and he said, I'm having this dream about slaughtering you, what do you think? He said, سَتَجِدُنِي إِنْ شَاءَ اللَّهُ مِنَ الصَّابِرِينَ. That you will find me by the will of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala among the patients. And then the next verse, it says, فَأَسْلَمَا. Then both of them surrendered themselves, conscientiously. They weren't forced. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had this inspired Ibrahim. He had this dialogue. Ibrahim had this dialogue with his son. And they both decided they're going to be Muslim. So this is the essence of Islam. The essence of Islam is not ikrah, coercion. Islam is submission conscientiously. That we do this because we believe it for the sake of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And on that point, I would encourage all of us, there is a class that will be here, and Cordoba is organizing this weekend on the Aqidah Tahawiyah. And this is a famous creed that's accepted by the majority of Muslims. And I encourage us to have the opportunity to go and listen and benefit from this program, to learn about our theology and to implement it within our lives. We ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to make us true Muslims. وَالْعَصْرِ إِنَّ الْإِنسَانَ لَفِي خُسْرٍ إِلَّا الَّذِينَ آمَنُوا وَعَمِلُوا الصَّالِحَاتِ وَتَوَاصَوْا بِالْحَقِّ وَتَوَاصَوْا